Good enough. Now, okay, we've got 9 participants on. So let's go back to the shared screen. Here. All right. All right. So on the standard agreement of sale, this is a 14-page document. So it can be a bit of a pain, but it's really simple.
Tim, hate to
Yeah.
interrupt you, but your screen share went away.
You can't see it?
Nope.
Oh, that doesn't make sense. Go back here to the Chrome tab and everybody can see it now?
Yep, got it.
All right. All right. So starting at the top, basically the buyer's names are what you're going to fill in here. Now, here's a little side note. You might want to just note this down. I recommend, by the way, you have a little notepad next to you with a pen just to take a couple of notes that I talk about here because we don't have time to explore showing you how to do all this. But I'm assuming by now everybody is on the MLS and knows how to get this stuff. So before you can write an offer on a property, you should have in front of you a copy of the listing. I also recommend you have a copy of the tax record, tax map under CRS tax records. So you can have that information handy because you're going to need that information to fill this out. And then last but not least, while you're in the MLS, you should also upload a copy of the seller's disclosure and if applicable, lead paint disclosure that will usually be on the listing. And you should have those ready to go because when you set up your file to send to your buyer for signature, which I'm showing you how to do that through the Zip Forms program. You can always print them out and meet your people in person and do wet signatures. But most of the time these days, I find most people end up doing their offers through the Zip Form program and then setting them out to email them out to their clients for signature. So you're going to need those things in front of you so that you can get ready to send this thing when it's all finished. Buyer's name, ask the people how they're taking title. Don't assume that Joe and Mary Smith are not Joseph and Mary Ann Smith or Joseph B and Mary Ann A Smith. So ask them how they want to take title to the property. That's important. As far as the seller side goes, the tax record should show you who owns the property right now. Typically, that's where you'll find it. And so that's why you want to have the tax record in front of you. It's not required that you fill out the buyer's mailing address or the seller's mailing address. Some people do it, some don't. I usually don't. Okay. Under address of the property, you want to put in the actual physical address. That's what's also going to be on the tax record. But you got to pay attention to a couple of things. Sometimes you'll have a property that says, well, let's take our office in Allentown. We are 90 North Cedar Crest Boulevard. Our mailing address is Allentown, PA 18104. However, we are in the municipality of South Whitehall, county of Lehigh, of course, and we are in the school district of Parkland. Okay, so needless to say, those are important details you need to pay attention to because the multiple listing, if we had our office listed, would show Allentown, PA 18104. But then down in the tax record, it'll show it's in South Whitehall and it'll also show you that it's Parkland School District. That's why you have a copy of the tax record in front of you. That information is also on the listing as well, but it's a lot faster to get it from the tax record. And mainly why I ask you to get the tax record is because you got to fill in the tax ID number. And sometimes agents, do a typo. So the listing could have the wrong tax ID in it. If you click on the tax ID in the listing, you'll know whether you got it right or wrong because it won't come up if they've got a digit out. But just to be on the safe side, I recommend going there. And if you have the tax ID, it says and or you do not need any more of this stuff. You don't need recording date, deed book volume and page, parcel number. You don't need any of that. It just says tax ID and then it says and or it would be if you didn't have a tax ID. I've never found a property that I did not have a tax ID. Now, by using the template, you'll see that the information is already saved in here for me. So that's our office, our company license number and all that's there. It's all set up in the template that way. Actually, this is wrong. I always end up changing. I don't know why my cell phone shows up the company phone, but it's not important right now. My license number, I add my cell phone here. Okay. Seller's relationship with PA licensed broker. Where do you think you're going to get that from? It's going to be on the listing. And sometimes the address doesn't show up if you don't print the listing out in what's called the PDF format. If you do, you'll get the company name and address. But if you're not sure what it is, if you click on the listing in the MLS, you can get to that page where it has the office address, their license number, their phone number, and fax number. And then, of course, when you click on the licensee, all on the listing, by the way, you get their information as well: license number, email address. You need all that stuff from those sources. That's why I told you to take a note and have those things in front of you before you go to prepare this contract. Now, in a typical situation, unless you're the same agent or somebody else's, the listing agent that's in our company, okay, you would be simply a buyer agent. But if you are a dual agent, make sure you check that box. So in our company, we don't practice what's called designated agency. So you will or either be a buyer agent, or if you're selling a company listing or selling your own listing, you will be a dual agent, and so will the company. Therefore, if you are a dual agent, you basically explain this part right now about how dual and designated agency works. By now, you should have already done that anyway, because once you get to this point, you've already met with the client, you've had them sign a buyer agency agreement, and you've had them sign a consumer notice. I'm covering the paperwork here at the moment, but I'll go back a little bit in time on the theory of where you need to start with this, because we're going to get to there very, very quickly here. All right, so that's dual or designated agency. Now we get to this page here. And of course, the date that we're going to put in here is going to be the day you're writing the offer. So hypothetically, let's say we're writing an offer today. And let's say, and I'm going to keep the numbers simple so that we're dealing easily with the math, but let's say we're offering 300,000 for the property. Okay. Hit that button, 300,000 prints up over here. And then we have a chance to determine, how many days for the initial deposit. So if you're not aware of this by now, when you put in an offer for the property, after your property is accepted, you have the default time 5 days to get that deposit to the listing agency, assuming the listing agency is holding escrow. Most are, but there's a few companies out there that don't. In that situation, then we hold the escrow. But typically, I find the 5 days is fine. I rarely put anything different in here. The 5 days is fine. As far as we get the deposit goes, I recommend you think a little bit about how you want your offer to be perceived. Um, you can literally put $1 in there, and technically you've got an offer backed by consideration. But what seller is going to take their property off the market for $1 deposit, or for even that matter, $1,000 deposit? I go more for like, well, by this time I know how my buyer's financing, because we've gone through the pre-approval process. So let's say my buyer is buying this property, they're doing conventional financing, and they're putting 20% down. If they're putting 20% down on a $300,000 offer, that's $60,000. Now, do I need that kind of deposit? No, but I'm certainly not shy about asking for 10 or 15 or 20. Let's make sure that they understand that the deposit is part of the overall money they're going to need to close on the property. So it's not in addition to; it's going to be part of the process. They have to put $60,000 down on 20% financing on this property, and they also have to pay their closing costs, which may be another $20,000. So they're coming up with $80,000. Shouldn't you expect to find that they'd have 20 or 25,000 they could put down up front? You want to make your offer look as strong as possible, in case, and in all likelihood, you're dealing with a multiple offer situation. Don't be the weak one in the group. So go for that larger deposit. So let's assume I've had that conversation and my buyer is willing to put $20,000 down. So then 20,000 goes in here. Here it is. Oh, it did go in there. Yeah, okay. So $20,000 down. I don't need anything filled in here. There's no additional deposit needed, so we can skip that. Sometimes if people don't have all the money now and they want to put 5,000 down now and 15,000 in 2 weeks, we would use this second line. Otherwise, I generally don't use it. Deposits, regardless of the form of payment, will be paid in U.S. dollars to the broker for the seller, unless otherwise stated here. That's normally how it goes. But if you do have a listing that your buyer is buying, and in the agent remarks, the company says that this company does not hold escrow, then you would say, unless otherwise stated here, and that would be deposits would be held by the broker for the buyer in that case. And that would be what you would fill in on this line, who retains sums in escrow in conformity with all applicable laws and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Oh, checks tendered as deposit monies may be held on cash pending the execution of the agreement. That's true, but usually we get the agreement executed first. Now, here's an important change. This took effect, this paragraph 3 basically took effect last August 17th. Okay. And so this is one of the changes that we have to talk about right now. So the buyer broker fee or closing cost assistance thing is a thing that we put down here based on having a CBC. Now, what is a CBC? A cooperating broker compensation addendum is what it really is. So basically, you can talk to the listing agent in advance and find out what type of commission they are offering, if any, on behalf of the buyer side. In which case, then you have to talk about what type of commissions you set up with the buyer agency agreement. So we're going to stop here for now and go to one of those forms. So go back here. And now let's kind of set the stage on how this actually works out. So let's start from the beginning. The first thing that you're going to do when you meet a new client, and basically, when I talk to someone on the phone, I get their email address. I could send this to them in their email. So I send them a copy of the consumer notice, and then we talk about the agency thing. Okay, so here's a consumer notice. You should all be familiar with this form by now. They cover this in the real estate courses you took. We basically can work as a seller agent. That would obviously be the person who is has the listing. So when you're listing a property, you explain to your seller you're working for them. Okay. We can work as a buyer agent. So in this particular case, we're dealing with the buyer side. So as a buyer agent, we're basically telling the buyer we work in their best interest. We're going to work to get them the best price for the property in the shortest amount of time, and the best conditions that they would like to have. And that's simply what a buyer agent does. Okay. Sometimes we can be a dual agent. So hypothetically, let's say you have a listing. You listed this property a week ago and you go, man, I got somebody I think that would be interested in this property. Now you bring your buyer into the mix and you've already got a contract with them because you've already been showing the properties. That would be the time that you would be a dual agent. Okay. You're working for the seller and the buyer in the same transaction. And you want to explain it to them that way. Now, the way I do that in the listing is when I first list the property, I tell the seller. So basically, dual agency means that I and anybody in my company, all 120 that work for Century 21 Kime, want to also be able to show your property. And if one of the other agents has a buyer for that property, it means that the entire company and the agents are all dual agents. Okay. And I tell that to the seller and say, now you, as the seller, have a right to exclude us from doing that. If you don't want to participate in dual agent, you're basically saying, Tim, I don't want you to ever sell my property. I just want outside companies to do it. And I don't really want any of the agents from Century 21. Well, I've never had a seller tell me that. The seller says, of course, I want you to show it and sell it if that's possible. Great. So they understand dual agency. The way I explain it to the buyer in this situation where I'm showing them one of my listings or a company listing, I tell them that, well, we already have a contract with this seller. So in that case, we would be dual agents. Now, what I will tell them, if it applies, unless it's my own listing, if it's another agent in my company, I will tell them that. So even though it's another agent in my company and we're dual agents, I really don't know anything about the seller that I would have to hide from you anyway. And they don't know anything about you, and I'm not obligated to tell them anything about you that you've shared in confidence. So it's as if we do have separate agents on the contract, even though we are all dual agents. So we do work in the best interest of all parties. And that's pretty much how I explain the consumer notice. Now let's get out of this one and go to now. I'm going to cover the non-exclusive agency form first, and I'll tell you why I'm doing that. Depending on the relationship you have with this buyer, if this was a cold referral, a lead, anything the way that you attain this buyer, as opposed to somebody who's already in your warm market, such as your contact program, your contact management program. If you've got a family, friend, relative, whatever that you're working with, I generally don't even bother with a non-exclusive agency. I give them the exclusive agency and say, I'm assuming you want to work with me, and therefore you're going to hire me to be your agent. But when I'm dealing with someone who, let's say I got somebody who called on my listing and they say, "Hey, I saw your property on 123 Main Street. I want to know if we can get in there." Sure, let me check the showing instructions. Give me your phone number. I can call you back, and we can look at that. By the way, when are you available to take a look at the property? So I'm kind of already preconditioning them to work within my time frame, my schedule here. And they say, "Okay, yeah, no, we're good. We can see it tomorrow. Let me double check the showing instructions. Okay, good news. That one's vacant, so we can get in there anytime." Or what if, oh, that one's actually tenant occupied? We must give tenants 24-hour notice. So I could show it to you as early as tomorrow, let's say after like 10:30. Does that work for you? Yeah, we're good at 1 o'clock. Okay, let me set up the appointment for 1 o'clock tomorrow. By the way, before I can show you the property, I have to have you sign a non exclusive agency form, which says that you will hire me to represent you should you decide to buy that property. Would that be okay? And they say yes, or maybe they say no. Either way, if I get their email address, I can email them the non exclusive buyer agency form and the consumer notice. Now, why do I start with a non exclusive buyer agency form with a cold referral person, somebody I've never met before? Well, I need to size them up and they need to size me up. And quite frankly, the new rules that we're required to follow here is we must have a buyer agency form signed, whether it be exclusive or non-exclusive, before we're allowed to show the property. So if we can get it out of the way first, that's great. If we can't, then you must make sure, and you remember this from real estate classes, you must make sure you bring a copy of the non exclusive. You can bring the exclusive as well. Maybe they love you so much they hire you exclusively right off the bat. I'm not that good. Okay. You got to get a non exclusive signed before you can show them the property, and you should have the consumer notice with you as well. So many times I've just printed out both forms, had it with me when we met. We got our cars both in the driveway. We're about to go open a lockbox, and we say, "So we got a couple of housekeeping things we got to take care of first." It's exactly how I say it. So before I can show you the property, you have to officially hire me. And then I explained to them that what the non-exclusive buyer agency is. So basically, all this means, Joe and Mary, is that if you like this property and you want to buy it, you have to work with me on that. Okay. And first question it asks on here is, do you have a written agreement or buyer agency with another broker? If they say yes, then you have to ask them, is it a non exclusive or an exclusive? If they say it's an exclusive, stop right there. You're wasting your time. You can't show them this property. Okay. They have a written exclusive buy. If they have a non exclusive, however, you can have them also have a non exclusive with you, which simply means that. So, Joe and Mary, if you decide to buy this property at 123 Main Street, it means you will strictly be able to work with me and any other properties that I would show you. So, if we see 4 or 5 more properties in the next week or so, it simply means that you're willing to work with me on anything I show you. Anything you've seen with another broker or anything you will see with another broker, you're free to go ahead and look at that. That's primarily the difference between the non exclusive and the exclusive. So you fill this out, okay? You got their name, got their address, their email, their phone number, their cell phone. If the answer here is no, that would be what we would check. You might be handwriting this if you haven't sent it in advance, okay? And it states buyer understands that this non-exclusive agency contract is between broker and buyer and broker, and that the broker will, with the buyer's agent responsible. Okay, under the terms agreement. Pretty much what I said. Starting date, it's really up to you. How much time do you want to put on here? The starting date is the date signed. Okay. And no law or association has set or recommended a term of contract. Buyer and broker agree that this contract is not time limited, but applies only to the properties listed below, if any, and any other properties introduced or shown to buyer or broker after signing the contract. Pretty much what I just said. Pretty much how I explained it. So what I would do here, if I'm at the front door filling this out, is I would add 123 Main Street here, and that's all I need to do for now. Broker's fee, no law or association has set or recommended a fee. Therefore, I put down here, broker's fee paid by buyer to broker is as follows. In purchase transaction with a seller represented by a real estate broker, this broker or another broker, the fee is. It's up to you. Now, what I recommend you do is use at least 3%. Now, let me explain why. If you're not aware by now, I'm going to tell you that if a agent is offering a commission, another, if a seller through the, the CBC is recommending or is offering a commission, let's say they're offering 2.5, then I can certainly say 3%. or whichever is greater, and I can add a dollar amount. I never need to do that. Okay. And if they're only paying 2.5, I can accept that commission as 2.5. What I can't do is if I put 2.5 here and a seller is offering a 3% commission, I am not allowed to accept that other half percent commission. So I recommend you start high. You can always tell your buyer that you'll work within the normal realms of what the other agent is offering, unless they're not offering any compensation or unless their compensation is well below the standards. What I tell my buyers right up front is I say, look, I pretty much will work with no less than 2.5. A lot of the companies out there are offering that, but sometimes someone is not. So you need to understand that potentially you may pay part of the buyer agency fee if applicable, but we'll know that in advance before you put in an offer on a property. So it won't be a surprise to you. I generally get my commissions from the seller, but there are certain sellers who will not offer a compensation. So if you want to see that property, well, quite frankly, I don't work for free. So it kind of comes down to where you may be responsible for paying that fee. Okay, so I tell them that up front. That way, there's no problem with it. And it also says with a seller who is not represented by a real estate broker, the fee is once again you put in the 3%. What does that mean? Well, let's say you find it for sale by owner, and let's say that for sale, your buyer really wants to see this property, and it's pretty easy. There's a sign on the lawn, and there's a phone number. I call the number. I say I've got somebody who wants to take a look at your property. Okay. And certainly I ask them to pay the commission or negotiate it in the contract if we can. If they say no, and my buyer really wants this property, they're paying me a 3% commission. That almost never happens. Both these situations generally don't happen, but they will at some point in time. So you need to be aware how that all works, and you need to be able to explain that to your buyer. So this is the way you fill out the form. And that's primarily our function today, is to show you how to fill out the form. So, there we go. We put that on there. Um, Advanced fee retainer. Okay, the law allows you to do this. If you want to charge your buyers a upfront fee to show properties, you're allowed to do it. I've never done it, but this is where you would do it on the contract. The advanced fee will credit against any other fee stated in this paragraph, unless otherwise stated here. You can put in things like it's non-refundable. If you want to see a property with me, it's $200. It's non-refundable. You pay up front. Yeah, you're allowed to do all that. Most agents don't, because it's not going to create a great environment for your relationship with this buyer, but you do have the power to do that. Regardless of source, broker will not retain any amount greater than broker's fee agreed to in paragraph 2B. Here it is, 2B, broker's fee. That's why we put that in there and said that, well, if the seller's only paying 2.5, I have the option of not charging them the other half percent, which is what I generally do. Okay. But I also, if they were really a pain in the butt to work with, I do have the right to charge them. I can say, well, you're going to pay me half percent, but at least the seller's paying 2.5. Either way, I find it better to do it this way because you're kind of protected from both sides. Okay. I have seen agents, by the way, put 4% in there. And that way it allows them to make sure they're collecting the maximum commission that the seller is offering, and that they have a right to connect an extra fee from their buyer if they want to. I don't do it, but I'm not saying you can't. Okay. All right. Here again, there's some things that are explained that like there are on the rest of the agreement of sale. We'll cover these and other things, but basically, it's the condition I just explained is right here. The balance of broker's fee is earned if buyers enter an agreement of sale for any property introduced or shown to the buyer, whether brought about by the broker, the broker's licensee, or by any other person, including the buyer or a different broker working with the buyer. If buyer defaults on the terms of an agreement of sale, broker's fee will be paid by buyer to the broker at that time. Buyers should advise that contacting the listing broker or selling directly may compromise broker's ability to earn cooperating commission or compensation from a listing broker, and can result in buyer's obligation to pay a fee to the broker. So it's important they understand that. Dual agency, we explained already in the contract, but you would have probably explained it here for the first time. Designated agency, you must check this box. At our company, we do not practice designated agency. And broker service to others, you'll cover this on the agreement of sale, so we'll not be redundant here, but you would have covered it here up front first. Entire contract, any changes have to be made in writing. Transfer the contract basically means that if someone buys their company or Lauren sells it to me and it becomes Century 21 Mahon, that's never going to happen. Then it would mean that I don't have to get all new documents executed. Whoever buys the company gets the contracts with it. Confidentiality, unless permitted by the buyer or required by law, a broker will not knowingly reveal or use any confidential information. Expertise real estate agents, we have to show them that we're competent. Deposit money, according to law, is held in escrow, cannot be held by the seller or the buyer, but it's up to whoever. Civil Rights Act, we get to cover fair housing, so we're going to be covering this on agreement of sale. Same thing with notice regarding convicted sex offenders, and the buyer has the right to have inspections done, but they accept the property in its present condition, subject to those inspections. And recordings on the property are allowed, okay, but they basically hold us harmless from anything that they do when it comes to that. And recovery fund exists to reimburse persons who receive by a final court ruling a misrepresentation or deceit in a real estate transaction. Additional terms. Please read. Buyer has read and received the consumer notice. If buyer is obtaining mortgage financing, buyer promptly delivers a copy of all loan estimates and closing disclosures. Upon receipt, buyer gives permission for broker to send information about that to the buyer's fax numbers. Return of agreement by any addendum, including electronic, bear the signatures is constitute acceptance. Contract may be executed in more than one part rather. And before signing, if the buyer has legal questions, they should consult a real estate attorney. All right, that's a lot, but a lot of these things that are covered on this paragraph are also going to be covered on the agreement of sale. That's the non-exclusive. Let's go back up a minute and explain where we go with the exclusive. No, we don't need changes. All right. This is the form I use when I'm dealing with a warm market person, and it's very much the same as the non-exclusive, but there's a couple of things that are different about it. So for years, this was the one that we always used, the buyer agency. It wasn't called exclusive; it was just called the buyer agency agreement. Okay, because it was always exclusive before. So once your buyer hires you, then they're obligated to pay you, even if they find and buy a property through another agent or agency. That's why it's called contract. Same thing when you list a property. When you list a property for sale, seller can't cancel your contract before going to a new contract. But it has happened in the past with buyers. So, needless to say, the exclusive agency is the best way to go. Now, for me personally, I'll tell you, after 38 years doing this, I almost never work with a buyer I don't know that hasn't been referred to me by either a past client, a family member, a relative, what have you. Okay. Pretty much that's where all my business comes from. Someday yours will too. Okay. But I've got a vast amount of past clients. And of course, I've got a very large family. So all that helped me a lot when I was getting started in real estate. So I don't even have a non-exclusive agency form pretty much in my vocabulary in most cases. I simply send the exclusive agency form right away to my client. Okay. But if it's a brand new person you're dealing with, and if it's a brand new person I'm dealing with, but they've been referred by someone else, I still have no problem usually getting them to sign. If I do run into pushback, then I can always back up to a non exclusive agency form and explain to them that I cannot show them properties without it. But this is usually where I start. Pretty much reads the same as the other one to some degree, except there's some language in here that says they must go through me. My information is already filled out. I fill out their information. I'm usually setting this up to get it digitally signed, but as I said, default to meeting them in person and getting it signed there, just in case you don't get them to do it electronically. And it's the same question on there. Does the buyer have a written agreement? This should always be no. Okay. If the answer is yes, back up and find out. Oh yeah, well we did sign a non-exclusive with somebody from Remax, but we're not going to buy that property anyway. Then we're fine. So instead, here buyer understands that this exclusive buyer agency contract is between broker and buyer. Does the buyer have a written agreement such as a buyer agency contract with another broker? If yes, explain, and it's non-exclusive buyer agency, you're fine. Typically, it's going to be no because they're working with you for the first time because they were referred to you, or you knew them already. Okay, starting in any date of the contract would be this, and no law or association set up a time. You can put in a time here that this ends up, and I usually say, well, use at least 3 months. So today's the 3rd of June. I'd go July, August, September, and I just simply put that date in. Okay. Um, Nothing needs to be filled out here because this contract starts when signed, unless otherwise stated here. Well, it's going to be when it's signed. but I do put an ending date in there. Some people feel better using 6 months. I know when I list properties, I generally do a 6 month contract. There's nothing says you can't, but if I get a buyer that says I need to be in something by September, well, this should work. We should have something signed before then. So once again, the same thing with the buyer agency fee. You must put in here what you want to work with this buyer. So for me, I put the 3% in here again. Okay. Or whichever is greater, that would be for extra fees. And with the sellers not represented by a real estate broker, the fee is also 3%. And I explained to them that I'm going to negotiate my fee in the contract. But if we're not successful in doing that and you still want to move forward, then that fee may fall onto you. But in my past experience, that rarely happens, almost never. Okay. You do have the right to charge them a retainer fee if you want to get crazy with it. I don't do it. You can have an advance fee the advance fee would be credited to it if you are going to collect the fee up front. That's what some people do. I don't work that way, but I'm telling you the form allows for you to work that way and get a fee up front. There was an agent years ago that used to take people to see a bunch of rehab properties that were somewhat in the Reading area, and they were priced at like $10,000 or less. And he would take more than one party out. He'd get like three different buyers in his car at the same time, all looking at these properties, and he would charge them a flat fee to do that. And they would all chip in and pay for his gas and everything else. Mainly because they were buying cheapo properties that needed rehab. They were all kind of investors, that sort of thing. And that's where this would fit in perfectly. I didn't do that, but an agent in our company did. And actually, she was very successful with it. And so this is where something like that would work out. Once again, don't forget to check off designated agency as an applicant because we don't practice it. And all the rest of the language from the last contract is all in here again as well. They sign it, you sign it, and initial it, and that pretty much takes care of that form. So, anybody have any questions on the exclusive and non-exclusive at this point in time?
I do, Tim. This is
Okay.
Vanessa. Because I missed it. You were saying that it's okay when you put the 3% there for both, both of those parts. And it's okay to tell them that you will, if they're paying 2.5%, that I will just accept the 2.5%.
Yes. So
Yeah.
that's really up to the discretion of you, the agent. The reason why I put the higher number in there is I don't want to lose the ability to make a higher commission. What if the seller's offering a 3% buyer agency fee and I only have 2.5 on there? I can't collect that other 0.5%. And I'm going to show you where that is when we go back to the agreement of sale in a minute. So I really don't want to do that if they're willing to pay through. Now, what I can't do is, let's say you've got somebody who's offering 4% commission. Well, I wouldn't be allowed to collect that 4% with my 3%. But almost nobody I know is offering a 4% commission out there. But some are offering a 3, and a lot of them are just doing a 2.5. I'm going to say the most common one you're going to run into is a 2.5% buyer agency fee. Okay. That's usually what I work with on my sellers when I list properties, but we'll cover more about that in the selling process next week. So the bottom line here is, if I put the 3 on there, I'm covered both ways. I mean, now let's say, in all fairness, let's say these people were really difficult to deal with along the way. Okay. Well, then I have every right to collect that other 0.5% because they were a pain in my ass. Okay. I wouldn't tell them that to their face. I'm just saying I like to cover that up front just to say that, hey, I was going to give them a break, but the bottom line is I'm not going to give them a break because they were a pain in my ass. All right. But the point is that most of the time that isn't the case. So we do usually end up getting people to, basically work with us. And yes, on the buyer sides, generally, if they're offering 2.5, I'm satisfied, but I'm covered either way. Hope that answers that question. All right. Now let's go back to the agreement of sale. So we're going to go back here. Everybody can still see this, right? Somebody tell me you can see this.
Yes.
Okay, good. Because the last time I clicked off that, it went away. So, all right.
You're still on exclusive. Oh.
Yep. We're going back to the agreement of sale.
Oh.
I usually don't interrupt the agreement of sale, but with this new stuff that we need to do, I felt it appropriate we do that. So back to the agreement of sale, and yeah, I didn't save that information. It was on there. It's no big deal. Uh, Actually, some of it did save. So here's the $300,000 offer, $20,000 down. All funds paid by buyer, including deposit monies, are paid by check, cashier check, or wired funds, and anything paid within 30 days of settlement. That's important, by the way, including funds paid at settlement, will be by cashier's check or wired funds, but not by personal check. So if you're writing an offer on a property and it's a cash offer and you're going to settle in 20 days, the deposit that's due within the same 5 days, that $20,000, cannot be a personal check. It must be a certified check. Now, you'll also see, and this is why, again, you have a copy of the listing in front of you, and you want to print the agent copy. I didn't make that clear before, but you want to see what's in the agent remarks on the listing. You also get a chance to look on there and see if there's anything there about who's holding the deposit and if that company even accepts personal checks. So, at the discretion of the brokerage, some brokers out there do not accept personal checks, even if the settlement is going to be 60 days away. So even though the contract says you can do it that way, individual brokers had the right to say, hey, you got 5 days to get us a deposit. We want a certified check, no personal checks. If that's the case, you must instruct your buyer that they got to go to the bank tomorrow if their offers accepted and get a certified check made payable to that broker, ABC Realty, for the $20,000. And it must be a bank check, not a personal check. Most of the time, if you don't see that in the remarks, then that company will accept personal checks. And if you are doing a normal sale with financing involved, you're not settling it in 30 days anyway. Okay. You usually want to work within a comfortable window of about 45 days. So I do recommend you stick within that time frame of 45 days, in which case I generally can get a personal check from my buyer at after our agreement is signed. Because keep in mind, I'm doing this electronically. If our offer gets accepted, then I'm going to be saying, okay, first thing we need to do is get them the deposit check. How soon can you get that to me? Go to your bank and drop it off at my office. I will then drop it off at the listing agency and we'll go from there. That's pretty much the way it works most of the time. But just pay attention to that thing that settlements within 30 days cannot have personal checks as deposits. Has to be a bank check. Okay. Now, this paragraph 3 is the whole reason I went back in there and explained all that. Besides the consumer notice, the exclusive and non-exclusive agency form. I didn't show you the CBC form, but we'll cover that briefly. It's actually in the listing paperwork, not here, but I'll pull up the form and show you what it is. And you can ask for a copy of that from the agent. Most agents I find don't do that. So if I'm not sure, then I fill it in here. So in addition to any cooperating compensation negotiated between the broker using the cooperating broker compensation agreement, that's the CBC from PAR, or via some other agreement, which might be a conversation or an email, seller will pay the following fee to broker for buyer on behalf of buyer at settlement. And that would be, and I generally wouldn't use a flat fee amount. There are cases where you might do that, but that's where I would put it in here. So let's say, for example, that they're paying a 3% commission, and I only said on my buyer agency 2.5. Okay. So then what I would have to do is I can only collect 2.5. That would go on here, but I could award my buyer the other 0.5%. That's why I fill that out. So hypothetically, I don't do this way, but I'm showing you the purpose of the form. Under seller concessions, I got a seller. If the seller says I'm paying 2.5 and I'm not going to charge my buyer the other 0.5% because that's what they're paying, then that's what I would simply put in there. Nothing would be here. Okay. If I was going to charge the other 0.5% to my buyer because I put 3% on my exclusive or non-exclusive agency form, that doesn't go here. That's already been agreed to on the fact that we have the agency form signed. So the only thing that gets put on here is what the seller's offering. Let's say the seller is offering the 3%, 3.0. That's what goes there. I've already got my buyer agency form signed with 3%. I have nothing else to do here. Only if I'm in that situation where I did a non-exclusive or exclusive agency with the buyer at 2.5 and the seller was offering more, okay, would I go back here and say, well, the seller's offering 3%. I legally can't collect 3% because I got a contract that says I can only collect 2.5, but I can have the seller give the buyer the other 0.5% because I'm working for the buyer in their best interest. So if the seller is doing that, that's how I would fill out this form. Do I have any questions on this?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I'm working with new construction right now,
Mm-hmm.
and Ryan Holmes only pays 5,000, but I'm going to collect the rest from my buyer.
Okay, interesting scenario. So now, what do you have on your agency form?
I put 3% and 3%.
Okay, so basically, they're obligated to pay you a 3% commission. So the way you would fill that out. So obviously, since they're offering less, nothing's going to go here. We're not getting any
So
closing cost assistance. So
for the
basically, we go
for
ahead.
the new construction, they have their own contract.
Yeah, they do, but you have a buyer agency agreement, right?
Yes.
So that means you would probably not be filling out the contract, but they may very well use the contract that we have for new construction in PAR. Some builders do use the PAR form, some don't. Either way, the builder is represented by an agent, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a licensed real estate agent that is working for the seller in this case, in this new construction.
Yeah.
That means there's a CBC, right?
Yeah.
And the CBC says $5,000.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to go here if you're using the PAR form. If you're not, it's going to go on a similar place on the builder's contract, or you're going to insist that it be added as an addendum,
Oh,
depending on the
okay. That's what I
contract they
have to
use.
do then. Okay.
Yes.
Because
You,
they just signed the contract, but I thought I just had to let the title company know.
well, you do, because it's going to be on. You see, what you have backing you is the fact that you have something. You got a CBC that says 5,000, and
Yeah.
you've got a buyer agency agreement that says they're paying you 3%.
Yeah.
So if you're not even preparing the contract, that's not appropriate for this particular class, but it's still a great scenario to bring up. So, folks, just so you know, I haven't done much new construction in my career because I find working with builders to be very boring. Yes, you do get paid, but most of the work with your client ends up being directly with the builder, because all the things about paying for extras and stuff like that. And yes, builders are allowed to use their own contract, especially if they're not represented by an agent, which is sometimes the case, but they'll still entertain offers from real estate licensees such as us. So it can get a little bit in the weeds here. You just want to make sure that if you run into this scenario, you talk to me or you talk to Lauren and find out, making sure that we're going to get paid. Now, Vanessa did this all the right way because she's got a CBC, which says the broker for the seller is obligated to pay us this flat fee of $5,000. You got to do a little bit of math on your calculator here. So if the sale price, I don't know what the sale price is, but let's say it's $500,000 for new construction. That's probably about the going rate or higher nowadays for new construction. Well, if they're paying $500,000 and you're getting paid a 3% commission, that's what are we looking at here? That's $15,000. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, 3% on 100,000. Okay, that's 3,000. So $15,000 would be the commission. They're paying 5. Therefore, your buyer is paying you $10,000 on the settlement statement to you for your commission. If you're not even writing it up, then a similar clause like this will be on the builder's contract. But let's say you run into this same scenario and it's not new construction like Vanessa's doing here, and the builder or the seller agent is only offering a flat fee. Well, then that's what would be put here. Okay, you would not be using a percentage. But if your buyer agency form was paying you a 3% commission, then obviously the rest of the commission less $5,000 would be what you'd be collecting. But there's no place to put that on the contract except this right here. So whatever is on the CBC, if you have one, or been introduced to you verbally or through an email, is what goes on here. It's rarely a flat fee, but in Vanessa's case, it was. It's almost always a percentage. Let's say it's not even 2.5. Let's say it's 1.5. Then that's what goes on here. But now your buyer is paying the other 1.5%. And there's no closing cost. The only time we use the closing cost assistance is if the commission is greater than what we put on our exclusive agency. And we are obligated, since we work for the buyer, to give that credit to the buyer. And that's why I use the scenario where you got a contract that says 2.5, and then you've got a seller offering 3. Well, you can't collect the other 0.5%, but you can award it to the buyer. Either way, what goes on this line is whatever is the case. Most cases, what you're seeing is 2.5 here, because that's what uh, most agents, most sellers are offering. But if you have a contract for 3, you have your agency form that would allow you to collect the other 0.5%. So there'd be no closing cost assistance. All right. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. That's the biggest change. The rest of the stuff is pretty much the way it's kind of always been. We're going to roughly breeze through this in the next hour. Okay. But those are the big important things to kind of take away from today. Number one, before you can set up this contract, have your consumer notice and some agency form signed. If all else fails and it's they called an hour ago and they want to stop by your listing and you're meeting them there, maybe they don't have the ability to do an e-sign right now. You print the forms out and you take them with you and you have them sign them at the house. Do not enter the building and show them this property without having that form signed. And let me tell you the reason why. Because this is being very hard tested by the real estate commission right now to make sure we're following the rules. That means that there are people out there who are testers. Yes, you might pick up one. They might call on your listing, or they might call you directly because they've got everybody's name from the real estate commission and phone number in the files. They call you up and say, hey, Tim, I want to see this property you have on 123 Main Street. Can we see that in an hour? Well, I don't know. What's your name? Okay, Bill. Yeah, let me see what I can do. Give me a phone number. I can call you back. Okay, great. Let me see what the showing instructions are on that. I look up the showing. Yeah, that good news. That's vacant. I get you there in an hour. Uh, Before we do that, I have a little bit of housekeeping, and I explain the agency agreement. If you're can get an email to you and you can sign it, that'd be great. If not, I'll bring a copy with me. I tell them that up front. Now, I might be wasting my time. I have no way of knowing this, but at least I'm not going to be fined by the real estate commission for breaking the rules. Be aware there are testers out there in everybody's market, and you might get one if you get one. So, of course, obviously, if you're dealing with your brother and your mother and your friend next door, you don't have any of that to worry about. But you should still do the right thing and get this stuff done right. All right. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. Closing cost assistance only used really in this case if it's something that's being done upfront, basically to compensate the difference of commission. Now, settlement date. A rule of thumb thing I put in here is you want to work, if there's financing involved, and in this example there will be, if there's financing involved, then you want to work with a 45-day window or 45-ish, I should say. So let's use some common sense here. Today is June the 3rd. All right. So June the 3rd, could I settle by the middle of July? Yes. Okay. If it's June 15th, can I settle by the middle of July? Probably not. I'm going to probably look for something the latter part of July, maybe the last week or so. So I'm not saying it has to be strictly 45 days. I'm saying it's tough to get it all done in 30 days, especially as we go through this. If there's inspections involved, if there's financing involved, then there's going to be an appraisal involved. We don't control the appraiser schedule. The buyer has a few things to do as part of the time of the essence clause, meaning that they got to make sure that they get the deposit in. They also have 7 days to do the mortgage application, 7 days to get the title work done, and typically 10 days to get the inspections done. These are all times of the essence clauses, which we'll cover in a minute or so. So, as a rule of thumb, use a 45-day window here, or 40, no less than 40. You can use a little bit more than that. Well, actually, it'd be best for us if we could settle by the 3rd week of July. Okay, well, then let's use that. Today's June 3rd. That should be no problem. It might be a 50-day window. But really, you don't want to work with less than 40 days because it doesn't allow you time for the process to unfold like it's supposed to. Okay. Settlement has to occur where the property is located or in adjacent county during normal business hours unless buyer and seller agree otherwise. We don't get to agree otherwise. Okay. We cannot settle outside banking business hours. It's that simple. Part of that's because nowadays funds are wired to the settlement table, sometimes at settlement or maybe an hour before settlement. So the bottom line is that it's got to be during the time when banks are open. Now, in a cash deal, if you got a willing title company that would want to settle on a Saturday, can you? Sure. Okay. But only 3% of the time is your offer is your offer going to be cash? So most of the time, you got to, and I had that conversation with my seller and my buyer, depending on which side I'm working on, and say, look, it is required that you take that time off to do that. It's not like we can settle after you're off work because you don't want to lose an hour's pay. Okay. So just to explain them, this is probably one of the most important things you'll ever do in your life is buying a piece of real estate. And so that means you got to give it the time it deserves. And we've got to meet in person to do that. And before a notary and sign all the documents, transfer a deed. Yeah, take off time from work to do that. By the way, the seller does not have to attend settlement. Okay. Seller's docs can be sent out earlier. You might have a seller that can't attend settlement. Maybe it's an estate and they're in assisted living. Maybe this is not their primary residence and you're selling their rental property and then they live 4 states away. So title companies can overnight docs to sellers. They can pre-sign everything at a local notary of their choosing where they are, and then they can overnight those paperwork back to us, and they can appoint you, their agent, power of attorney, to sign the final closing docs. Buyers have to attend settlement because they can't, seller just agrees to transfer the deed as long as the buyer gets all the money is pretty much the bottom line. But buyers must attend settlement in person. Okay. A lot of this is stuff that I touch base with on my buyers. Basically, the settlement date I've explained. Time of settlement, they will prorate taxes and any other municipal fees, condo fees, any rents if it's a rental property, association fees if it's an HOA. Water and sewer will be prorated as well, usually sending a final bill to the seller. Any other lienable municipal services such as trash, taxes, anything, they're all prorated. Seller pays up to and including the date of settlement, buyer pays after that. This just explains how taxes are broken up. It's real simple. County municipal taxes run the calendar year, January to December. School tax runs the fiscal year, which is from July 1 to June 30th. Okay. And then title companies know all that. Fee simple deed of special warranty is how it's usually transferred when you're dealing with residential real estate. There are other forms of ownership, but then there'd be a different contract. So, for example, if you're selling a mobile home that's on rented land, we have a mobile home contract that covers all that. That would be something that's called, instead of it being a fee simple deed of special warranty, it's called a leasehold. Okay. Either way, payment of transfer taxes are typically divided equally between buyer and seller. In most cases, it's 1% on each side. There are sometimes situations where a buyer, to make their deal look better, will be willing to pay the seller's transfer costs. That would be the case. Then we would put that in on this line right here. Sometimes some buyers do that as a negotiation point in a multiple offer situation. And I've also used it myself. Possession is delivered by deed, existing keys, physical possession to a vacant property, free of debris, with all structures broom clean at day and time of settlement, unless seller before signing the agreement has identified that the property is subject to a lease. Okay, so I make sure that I read that paragraph when I'm representing this contract to my seller if I'm on the listing side, making sure they understand what this term means. And I explain to my buyer, so we get to do a walkthrough inspection, and we want to make sure at that time that basically the property's been cleared out. That's what broom cleaned, free of debris to a vacant property means, okay, at the time of settlement. So, it's not going to happen before that, but that's what it's supposed to happen. And if we are buying the property, we're buying it as an investment, and it does have a lease, then we're going to check this box here and do a tenant occupied addendum. Okay. I'm going to uncheck it for now, but that's what that addendum would be for. And all a tenant occupied addendum is, and you can pull the form up, it doesn't default automatically in this package, but you go to forms and you put it in there if you need it. If you're buying a property that's got tenant occupied, well, then you have a right to see the leases and the terms of those leases, including any security deposit that may be paid. And there's also a thing in there that the seller must disclose if there's a problem with that tenant. Is that tenant behind? Has any part of the security deposit been already used to pay back rent? That's all covered on the tenant occupied addendum. So we have a right to know that information if we're buying a property that already comes with the tenant, because the tenant is protected under the law. If that tenant, like let's say my buyer is buying this property, it is tenant occupied, but the tenant's not going to be out of lease until 2 more months down the road. Well, I can still buy this property as my primary residence. I just can't move into it until the tenant moves out. Okay. But the financing allows for that. If you buy a property with conventional financing as your primary residence, it doesn't say you have to move in the day of time of settlement. It says you have to move in within 365 days. Basically, you have a year to move. That's how you can buy a primary residence that needs rehab, get it all rehabbed, and then move in when it's all done. That also applies to a property that's tenant occupied. I mean, unless the tenant's got a lease that's going to be extended longer than 1 year, in which case, let's say you're buying a property and they've got a 3-year lease, well, you're screwed in that case. You cannot buy this property and an owner occupy it unless you can get the tenant to, cancel their lease early. And that's assuming they're not in default already and haven't broken any of the tenant agreements in the lease. But we don't know that because we don't have a copy of the lease. This gives us the right to get a copy. Didn't mean to get off on the weeds on that, but it is something that does come up from time to time. You just need to know that it exists. And when in doubt, call your broker and we'll step you through it. Now, here's an important one here. Written acceptance of all parties will be honored before. I dated the contract the 3rd. I'm going to put the 4th in here. I'm basically saying I want an answer back. So the wording says written acceptance of all parties. Well, what if I don't get written acceptance? All I'm basically saying here is I want to hear something from you. If you're not accepting it, I want to know what you will accept. So I'm basically looking for a counter offer. So let's say this property was listed for 325 and my buyer's ready to offer 300 and we don't know of any multiple offers. Well, then it becomes a negotiation. So this day may change. Okay. But at the time I write the offer for my buyer, I promise to write them with the best terms and conditions for the buyer. The best terms and conditions for the buyer would be to hear back about our offer within 24 hours. Okay. So that's why I use 1 day here. This is just some housekeeping stuff. The settlement date and all other dates identified for the performance of any obligation of this agreement are of the essence and they're binding. This is important to know. We have in the state of Pennsylvania what's called a time is of the essence contract. What that means is anything we say we're going to do within the time frames we say we're going to do it become part of the contract and they're binding. Now, certain things would be waiver of rights. Another thing would be an actual default. So, for example, the first time we see a time is of the essence clause is right here. Initial deposit was due within how many days? 5. If I don't get that $20,000 from my buyer within 5 days, they're in default. We no longer have a contract. And even though my seller hasn't received the money, they can sue the buyer for specific performance and go to court and get their $20,000. That's why you go for large deposits, by the way. Buyers don't renege for $20,000. They walk away from $100 or $500 or $1,000. Don't make your sale weak. Getting down here below, we talk about the time is the essence clause, and the first time we put it in play was actually, it's up here. Hold on. I didn't fill in a date. It's actually right here. So let's fill in a day here. Let's say we said we're going to work with that 45-day window. So let's say we did, let's take that Friday the 18th. So I made settlement date July 18th. If settlement doesn't occur by that date, and it says or before if buyer and seller agree, then this sale falls apart. Okay, unless we do an extension addendum. So that's a time is of the essence clause, although it's the last one. It shows up here almost first. Down here, the next one we have is June 4th. Written acceptance of all parties on it before June 4th. That would be tomorrow. So we want an answer back by them tomorrow. Once this contract is signed, it becomes an executed contract, and that would be the date of execution. So hypothetically, they might accept my contract as is, get it signed by tomorrow. Let's leave it simple for now because we got enough things to cover on the paperwork. But hypothetically, let's say we would go through this tomorrow and they say, no, we're not going to accept it, but we'll accept the 325. Let's say my buyer says, okay, I'll give them the 325. Then we have to do a new contract or basically go into zip forms, change the appropriate terms, send it out for signature again, in which case now it's already June 4th. I would simply change this to June 5th on my new rewrite. Okay. So it also could be done on the seller's end where we have a conversation and they make the changes and then they send us back the changes, in which case then we're sending it to our buyer for initial. It can be done either way. Banks like to see clean contracts, so I try to do it this way if I can, but there we go. All right. Settlement date is not extended except in writing. Certain terms are pre-printed in the agreement and for the convenience, but all those terms can be negotiated. Zoning, you need to fill out how it's zoned. Once again, go back to one of the forms I told you to have in front of you. You go back to the tax record and you fill out the zoning information. Tax record will have all kinds of things. It's usually on the second or third page of the tax record, depending on which county you're pulling up. And it'll all have some kind of a code that none of us understand, but we use that. So a common one would be R-1 residential. It means rural residential. Some of them may say MDR, medium density residential, or HDR, high density residential. Those are common in the city. Okay, whatever is on there is what you put on here. It's that simple. So let's just say it's it could be agricultural, okay, mixed use, but let's call it medium density residential. That didn't come up. Yeah, medium density residential. All right. Whatever it says on the tax record is what you put here. All right. Fixtures and personal property. Real important thing here. So it's possible for certain items of personal property to be so integrated properly they become fixtures and will be regarded as part of the property and therefore included. Buyer and seller are encouraged to be specific when negotiating what items will be included or excluded in the sale. So going back to the listing again, under the agent remarks, if there are any exclusions, that's where you'll find them. Another thing you'll find on the listing is a list of any appliances that are supposed to stay with the property. That's where you'll find them. So you got to pay attention to those things. That's why I said at the beginning, have a copy of the listing in front of you, a copy of the uh, tax record in front of you, and of course, have the seller's disclosure ready to go for getting signature as well. That's where you find all that information out. Now, I do make sure that I read this paragraph B verbatim to my client. I do this when I'm getting an offer on one of my properties to the seller as well, because if there's an area that has caused many deals to fall apart over the years, or just make it an uncomfortable settlement, it's not understanding what the fixtures and personal property means. And while we basically know what that means because we took real estate classes, the bottom line is sellers don't know. Okay. And it's amazing. Even when you read this to them verbatim, sometimes they still screw up. So basically, I word it like this: included in the sale, unless otherwise stated, are all existing items permanently installed in or on the property, free of liens, and other items, including the plumbing, heating, gas fireplace logs, radiator covers. See how specific this is? Hardwired security systems, thermostats, lighting fixtures, which would include chandeliers and ceiling fans, pool spas and hot tubs, if applicable, including covers and cleaning equipment, electric animal fencing systems, excluding collars. The dogs get to keep their collars, garage door openers and transmitters, mounting brackets and hardware for television and sound equipment. So, for example, you got your TV hanging on the wall. You can take the TV off the bracket and take it with you, Mr. Seller, but you cannot take the bracket off and leave all these holes in the walls. I hate to tell you how many times I've seen that happen in situations. I can tell you more than 10 fingers on two hands. Okay. So a lot. Okay. I mean, I won't say always, but it happens. Okay. If I read this to my seller up front and they still do it, I go, God help you. But the bottom line is you got to simply make sure that you understand that. I read it to my buyers so they know what to expect. So getting back to working for the buyer, I'm reading it this way to them and saying, okay, so that stuff's supposed to stay where we leave off. Hardware for television, sound equipment, unpotted shrubbery, planting and tree. What is unpotted shrubbery? It's called the plants outside in the ground. I had somebody take 40 rose bushes up the day of settlement on a property that I had to buy her on. And I blamed the seller agent because he obviously did not read this verbatim to his client, or they wouldn't have taken the 40 rose bushes. Anyway, needless to say, at settlement, they ended up giving us $700. And this happened in the 90s, by the way. They gave us $700 for the mess they made. Okay. Because that's what it was going to cost to fix it. That's why you don't want these problems and you read these. And even when you read these things, they can still screw up. But if you cover it both times when you're working for the seller and you work for the buyer, it's less likely you'll run into a problem. So where we leave off, unpotted shrubbery. So you got a rubber tree plant in a bucket, take it with you. But the grass, the trees, the shrubbery, all that has to stay. Okay. Smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, sump pumps, storage sheds. Oh, I want to take the shed. You can't. It's considered a fixture. Fences, mailboxes, wall-to-wall carpeting, area rugs are fine. Okay. Existing window screens, storm windows, and screen or storm doors, if they exist. Window covering hardware. That includes rods and black brackets, shades and blinds, and awnings. It does not include curtains. The curtains don't have to stay. They can be removed from the curtain rod, but you're not supposed to take the curtain rods down. They're attached by a screw or a nail. They now become a fixture. Central vacuum system with attachments, built-in air conditioner. So a built-in air conditioner, obviously going to be central air or a through-the-wall air conditioner, not a window air conditioner. So built-in air conditioners, built-in appliances, the range and oven, whether it's considered built-in or not, that's supposed to stay. Dishwashers, trash compactors, haven't seen one of those in 30 years. Any remaining heating and cooking fuel stored on the property at the time of settlement, that's a big one. So if you got an oil furnace and there's, 200 gallons of oil in there, that goes to the buyer at settlement. They do not reimburse you for that. We used to. You talk to some old people in the business a long time ago, we'd had the tank dip just before settlement, and whatever the line was reading, the buyer would write a check to the seller for his last paid per gallon cost on his bill, which might have been 79 cents a gallon, by the way, at the time. And the buyer would write a check to the seller. Well, then sometime around the mid 90s, EPA came out and said you cannot resell used oil that's already in a tank because it's considered contaminated. Therefore, there is no reimbursement. So the conversation I have when I read this to my seller is, are you on automatic delivery? Stop that immediately. Don't get your tank filled up. Now, while you are obligated to keep the property, the heat on and utilities on, you got to keep an eye on the oil. Don't get any new deliveries. Just add oil as you need it. If you're getting close, it's mostly in the wintertime. If you're getting close to where you think you're going to run out, get 100 gallons delivered. Yeah, you might pay a little bit more per gallon, but whatever you put in that tank, you're giving it to the buyer at settlement. Let's go back a minute. Any remaining heating and cooking fuel stored on the property at the time of settlement. That's not just oil. That can be fireplace logs. That can be pellets for a pellet stove. That can be coal for a coal bin. That's heating or cooking fuel stored on the premises. It can be a propane tank. Now, this gets a little dicey. Does the seller own the propane tank? If he does, he owns the propane. If the seller does not own the propane tank, he can have it removed and the buyer can hire their own propane company, and the propane company will reimburse the seller for the propane in the tank. So there are advantages as a seller for not owning your own tank and having your gas delivered, because if whatever ABC gas company is taking the tank back, then they don't have to reimburse the seller. But they will reimburse the seller for the propane in that case, and we'll cover that in a second too. So back again to that. Any remaining heating and cooking fuel stored on the property at time of settlement. I usually stop here and I say to my buyer, now we know this place has a fireplace and it's a wood burning fireplace. So there's 3 cords of wood out there. That's going to stay unless the seller tells us otherwise. And I'll cover that in a minute. Okay. Um, if owned, solar panels, windmills, water treatment systems, propane tanks, and satellite dishes, unless stated otherwise, the following items are included in the sale at no additional cost. So if you go to the appliance section on the agreement on your listing, it'll show whether they're leaving other appliances that would not be considered fixtures. Typically, that's going to be a washer, dryer, refrigerator, could be a freezer in the garage or a chest freezer in the basement. These are things that may also stay with the property. If you don't add them here, the seller assumes you don't want them. So don't forget and leave this blank, because then you're going to go to the walkthrough and go, oh, wow, they took the washer and dryer. I thought that was staying. Well, it says on the listing it is, but we didn't ask for it. If you don't ask for it, they're not obligated to let you have it, especially if you negotiated the price on the property. They might say, well, I was going to leave you my $3,000 worth of appliances, but you basically, got me down 10,000 on the price and you didn't ask for them. So I'm not obligated to give them to you. And they aren't. Okay. So make sure you pay attention to that. See why I said paragraph 7 is so important. These are deal breaker issues that create hard feelings and can sometimes actually break the deal. Or at the least, problem is someone ends up taking money out of their pocket to satisfy it. Usually that's us, the agent, because we don't want to lose the deal because someone took a refrigerator they weren't supposed to. All right. So save yourself some hassles by getting all this stuff right. Now, paragraph C also may apply if the seller doesn't own something that's considered built in. that would be items that are not owned by the seller but may be subject to a lease or other financing agreement. Contact the provider vendor for more information. For example, solar panels, it's a big one, windmills, water treatment systems, propane tanks, and satellite dishes. So here again, if the propane tank isn't owned, then that would be put in there. Now, despite all the stuff that's said here in paragraph 7, if the seller really wants something that is considered a fixture, all they have to do is note up front to the buyer, and if the buyer accepts that term, it's fine. So if there is an excluded fixture and item, such as a maybe a family heirloom chandelier, they can take it if the buyer allows them to take it. Okay, so if they put it in the exclusion on there, then that usually you're going to find this on the age of remarks. Once again, go back to a copy of the listing, list whatever is, well, we can buy this product, but the ugly, oh, that's okay, I don't want that ugly thing. Anyway, I'll tell you one that's an odd one that happened to me. Okay, I had one seller a few years ago, probably was in Easton, I'll never forget it. Beautiful home. The seller wanted to keep the dishwasher. Yeah, they were going to take out the $1,000 dishwasher they put in. Not sure what it cost them for the install cost, but then they had to uninstall it. Then they were going to buy them a $300 dishwasher and pay to install that. And the buyer accepted it under those terms and conditions. I thought it was stupid because, in my opinion, the appliance, once it was put in and was used, it's not worth $1,000 anymore. Okay, if you're going to try to resell it on the market, you might get $200 or $300 for it, but you probably paid $100 to install it, and you probably paid $100 to uninstall it. But hey, I can't fix stupid. The bottom line is, it's a real live scenario where the seller kept their dishwasher, and I hit the seller, by the way. Seller kept the dishwasher, buyer accepted a brand new $300 dishwasher. Honestly, they were both stainless steel. I couldn't really tell what the difference was. But anyway, the bottom line was, there are such cases where the seller could say, I want to take the rods and the brackets too. Okay, means there's going to be holes in the wall. Are you going to patch them up? No. Well, the buyer can say, okay, I accept that, I'll take care of it. So as long as it's disclosed up front what's happening, you'll never have a problem with this section. But if you don't go through this section verbatim, you could end up with a problem that ends up costing you to reach in your own pocket, and I don't want to see that happening. All right. Buyer financing, this is an important one. Okay. So typically, the buyer is going to be doing financing. It says the buyer may elect to make the agreement contingent upon obtaining financing, regardless of any contingency elected in the agreement. If buyer chooses to obtain mortgage financing, the following applies. If the buyer will be in default of the agreement, if the buyer furnishes false information to anyone concerning their financial or employment status, or fails to cooperate in good faith. Within blank days, once again, here's the time is the essence clause. Within blank days, 7 if not specified, from the execution date, the date signed by the seller and all parties with an agreement, buyer will make a mortgage application, including payment for, ordering of credit reports without delay for the mortgage terms and the mortgage lender identified in paragraph 8A, 8F, if any, otherwise to a responsible mortgage lender of buyer's choice, and broker for the buyer, that would be you, if any, otherwise broker for the seller, is authorized to communicate with the mortgage lender to assist in the mortgage loan process. Broker for seller, if any, is permitted to contact the mortgage lender at any time to determine the status of the mortgage loan application. So this is where, when you're on the seller side, you get permission to talk to the lender involved. And the lenders know all this. This is standard stuff in our agreement. I just want you to understand. Seller will provide access to insurers, representatives, and, as may be required by the lender, surveyors, municipal officers, officials, appraisers, and inspectors. And if the mortgage lender gives buyer the right to lock in the interest rate at or below the maximum level desired, buyer will do so at least 15 days before settlement. That's all handled by the lender. So this is not actually a times of the essence clause. It's automatic. And then paragraph B just explains what loan to value is. The loan to value is the difference between the equity you put in up front, which is your deposit or down payment, and the amount that you're financing. We'll cover that in more detail in a minute. Regarding the financing, if your buyer is doing FHA or VA, or actually this even applies to any other government financing, which is USDA, PHFA, FHA, things like that, then you must fill in this line right here, which is the purchase price as stated in the agreement. So if we were doing an FHA contract, we're not on this example, then I would put 300 in here. In other words, the sale price of the property. The property must appraise for the property, or the buyer is not allowed to buy the property. That means you end up renegotiating the contract. Now, with conventional financing, this doesn't exist. And with conventional financing, which is beneficial to the seller, the buyer is not protected. So if you want to protect your buyer, what you would typically do is make your sale contingent upon the appraisal. We have such a thing as an appraisal contingency addendum, which we would use in that case. Okay, so that's FHA, VA, if applicable. It's continued down here. You have to check this box that the buyer has received a HUD notice for your protection, get a home inspection. That's required on all FHA, VA, or government contracts. It's not required on conventional, but I use it on conventional as well. Buyer understands the importance of getting an independent home inspection and has thought about this before signing the agreement. Buyer understands that FHA will not perform a home inspection nor guarantee the price or condition of the property. And then the next block would be if you're buying this property that needs work done on an FHA contract, they have a special financing program called a 203K, which allows the buyer to buy the property and secure repairs after closing on the property, as long as the repairs meet the requirements of what is required there, which is all work has to be done by certified contractors, not the buyer. Okay. Now, under mortgage contingency, you're going to waive it or elect it. It's real simple. In this case here, and in most cases, you're going to elect it. And it says the sale is contingent upon buyer obtaining mortgage financing according to the terms outlined below, upon receiving documentation demonstrating the mortgage lender's approval, whether condition or outright, of buyer's mortgage applications. According to the following terms, buyer will promptly deliver a copy of this to the seller, but in no case later than. Once again, here's a time frame that we need to work with here. Let me explain what we're doing here. The buyer controls when they do the mortgage application. They have 7 days to do that. They don't control the appraisal. The appraisal is what's going to be required for the bank to give them a final loan commitment. So this loan is not approved, even though your buyer has a pre-approval. What your buyer has with the pre-approval is only half the job. Okay. So while we do have the buyer pre-approved for this mortgage, and we got a copy of that letter before we looked at this from the seller's point of view, we had to make sure that the house is going to be approved. Well, we can't do that up front. We can get the buyer approved up front, but not the house. Okay. So therefore, we have what's called a commitment date. Oops. And this is where I say you want to use rule of thumb here, a 30-day window. So if I'm writing this on I might put down here, well, Friday, July 4th would be a holiday. I probably wouldn't use that. I'd probably go to um, July 7th, that Monday. So roughly 30 days from now, we're going to have that mortgage commitment. And there's a reason why this is a time is the essence clause. If we don't have the commitment by that time, the contract can be canceled by the seller. And the seller could maybe have a backup offer in the wings and say, nope, sorry, it didn't happen. So we're going to cancel your contract and take another contract. By the way, this just happened to me on a property. I'm on the listing side. Okay. And the buyer defaulted, pretty much defaulted. We didn't keep their money because it was a weak offer. It was only $3,000 down. Keep me in mind, this wasn't one of my agents. I didn't teach them. But my seller accepted the offer. It was a weak offer to begin with, and the buyer defaulted. We gave them their money back and we moved on to a backup offer because I knew it was a weak offer, and we continued showing the property based on that, and we picked up a second offer on the property, which ended up being better. And that property closes in about a week and a half. Okay. So this is a real life scenario. This does happen. Okay. So put in a minimum of 30 days as your rule. There's two numbers to remember here as a rule of thumb. Settlement date, you want to work with a 45-ish day window. Commitment date, you want to work with a 30-day-ish or so date. Can it happen sooner? Yes, but it has to happen by then. So give yourself that window of opportunity. This is why you don't try to close finance deals in 30 days. Because what if the buyer waits till the 6th day to do their mortgage application? Well, then they paid for the appraisal fee. Now the bank hires the appraisal. That could take another week. And then the appraiser might take a week to get the appraisal back to the bank before we find out whether we have an appraisal issue or not. Make life more simple for yourself. Write the offer this way and encourage your buyer, once they have their completed contract, to get with the lender. Don't wait 6 or 7 days. Get with the lender. Get this application process immediately. Now, under loan amount here, we're going to use a couple of numbers that are important. So I kept these numbers simple just to make the math easy. The loan amount, we know because the buyer's doing 20% down conventional and they're buying a $300,000 house, that they're going to be putting $60,000 down. Yes, I know on the agreement of sale, they're putting $20,000 deposit. The other 40 grand, I didn't need 60 grand up front as a deposit, but that's part of the 60,000 they need plus their closing costs. So up here, my loan amount's real simple. It's 240. That's what goes in there. The term is going to be 30 years. Okay. Typically, that's what's going to come back from the letter, unless it doesn't. I mean, every once in a while, you might get someone who says, I'm just doing a 15-year or 20. Well, if that's what the letter says on your pre approval, then you put that in here. But typically, the buyer, especially a first time buyer, is always going to be that. In this case here, I know this is a conventional, so that's what goes in here. And it's conventional. It could be, you can see what's in there. So conventional comes up. Now, for conventional loans, I must put in the LTV, the loan to value. What is it? That's simple enough. It's 80%. Okay. Notice if it is FHA or VA or USDA, I don't have to put anything in there. This is only for conventional loans. Now, it doesn't hurt if you do. Like you may know or you may not know, but all FHA is 3.5% down. Okay. So if someone's putting 3.5% down, the loan to value would be 96.5. However, you may not know this, but while the minimum deposit is 3.5% down, there's nothing stopping the buyer from doing an FHA application and putting 10% down. So whatever's on the letter is what would be on the letter. But either way, you're not required to put a number in here if it's if it's an FHAV or USDA or any government contract of any kind. But for conventional, you have a voidable contract. Doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means that in a court of law, if the buyer wants to get out of the deal, they probably could because it's now a voidable contract. Okay. So we want to make sure we don't create voidable contracts. Mortgage lender can be filled out if you already have that in there. I mean, it doesn't have to be. I generally leave it blank, okay? Because the buyer, the reason they have that 7-day window to shop to apply for the mortgage is they have the right to shop and compare lenders. Okay. Some buyers like to do that. Some of them are so ingrained with their lender, they love them so much they would never do that. If it's a lender I recommended, they generally don't do that. If it's a lender I've recommended for my buyer and that's who they got approved with, I usually do put that in here. So I would put ABC Mortgage Company down here, whatever it is. Yes, you should put the interest rates in if known. Now you should know because it should be on the pre-approval letter. In fact, with the pre-approval, I also ask for the lender, and I work with lenders I know all the time, so they do this for me, but any of them will if you ask. I ask them to send me a copy of the closing cost estimate for the buyer. That saves me the trouble of having to do one, and the lenders is going to be more accurate because I have no idea what the lender's fees are because they vary. So get a copy of the buyer's estimate of closing costs from the lender, had them sign a copy and put that in your file and your coverage should the state come in and audit your documents. Okay. And yes, put in the rate. Okay. So let's say, and I'm going to just keep it simple, they got a quote of 6.0, but they're willing to go up to 7.0. So as long as they get the mortgage rate between 6 to 7%, we're good. And under VA funding fee, not to exceed zero, I always use zero. So you never have to fill this in. Second mortgage, I almost forget this exists. There was a time in the industry when we could get a buyer to do conventional financing and they could do 100% financing because we'd get a second mortgage for $20,000 or for the $60,000, the 20%. It could be a home equity line of credit or something like that. And the buyer would actually go with no money. I haven't seen one of those in years. It could still happen, so that's why this is still here. But let's say you've got a buyer who owns several properties already and doesn't want to use any cash, but he's got equity in 3 other buildings he owns. He could actually take a second mortgage against one of those other buildings and use that as his down payment, okay? And then get his first mortgage on this property over here. On the seller side, we don't care that they do that because it really doesn't affect us at all. Sellers get paid 100% of their property at settlement, but the financing won't look as good if they're not putting any money down. What I like about having a mortgage like this is you got a buyer buying this property. They've already got skin in the game. Less so with a FHA or VA, but 20% down conventional is good as cash in my opinion. Lots of language down here that we don't have time to read. Just know that it has things like the interest rate provision says that the buyer must lock in at or below that. If they fail to do that, it could be a breach of contract if rates would go up and they didn't lock in. but also if rates went up higher than what they were, the maximum was, seller does have the option of contributing to the buyer's closing costs to help bring that rate down. That's called a buy down. So you can buy a rate down by paying upfront points. And a seller would be allowed, well, what if I give them another $5,000 in points? Will that get the rate below the maximum here? And if the buyer agrees, it could be done that way. Okay. Um, Seller may terminate the agreement of sale after the commitment date by written notice to the buyer if the seller does not receive a copy of the documentation demonstrating the lender's conditional or outright approval of buyer's mortgage, or the documentation demonstrating the lender's conditional or outright approval does not satisfy the loan terms required, or the documentation demonstrating mortgage lender's conditional outright approval of buyer's mortgage application contains any condition not specified in the agreement. For example, buyer must settle on another property, or an appraisal must be received by the lender, or the approval is not valid until the settlement date, that is not satisfied or removed in writing by the mortgage lender within 7 days after the commitment date, or an extension thereof, other than those conditions that are customarily satisfied. What does that mean? Okay, it's a lot of words. Here's the breakdown. Basically, if we get the commitment by that commitment date that was going to be July 7th, we're good to go. But let's say for whatever reason, not the buyer's fault, but for whatever reason, we don't have the appraisal back yet. And it's even beyond the time that I expected it, whatever that glitch might be. Well, then we go to the lender and says, give us a conditional approval subject to the appraisal, and let's get that damn appraisal back here within 7 days. I can buy my buyer an extra 7 days with the language of this contract here, if the seller agrees. Now, does the seller have to agree? No. The seller can say, screw you. You didn't get me the commitment in time. I got a backup offer. I'm terminating the agreement of sale. If the seller does terminate the agreement of sale, they must give the buyer their money back. So I'll relate back to my short story I told you a few minutes ago. I had a property that went under agreement. So it was to settle April 14th. It didn't settle. We had a backup offer. We could have taken the buyer to court for her lousy $3,000 deposit. And if we wanted to, because it clearly was a default, the buyer quit her job. But we didn't do that because we had a backup offer. So it was better for us to terminate the agreement of sale and return the deposit money to the buyer, or we would not have been able to execute a new agreement. So in that particular case, it says, so the right to terminate continues until the buyer delivers documentation demonstrating the mortgage lender's conditional outright approval of buyer's mortgage application to the seller. Until seller terminates agreement pursuant to the paragraph, buyer must continue to make a good faith effort to obtain mortgage financing. Termination of this agreement by the buyer due to mortgage lender's denial of buyer's mortgage application may demonstrate bad faith by buyer and result in the forfeiture of deposit monies to seller. Finally, if this agreement is terminated pursuant to those paragraphs above, where the mortgage lender is not loaned or not obtained for settlement, all deposit monies are returned to the buyer. So if the seller terminates for lack of performance, they can go after the buyer for the deposit. That's what it says here. Buyer may result in forfeiture of deposit. If the seller takes another offer and terminates the contract, basically they give the buyer their money back. We all go home happy and we go on with the new sale. That's what it basically means. Okay. And this just says that they have to allow anybody that needs to get in the property to see it. And if there are repairs required by an insurance company or even by a municipal, repair, seller can do the repairs and release them from harm, or the buyer can do them. If the buyer doesn't do them, then they terminate the sale. It's a lot of stuff. It, in short, works like this. If there's a municipal inspection or the buyer has their own inspection done, and the seller's not willing to do repairs, buyer can walk away. Okay. If the buyer doesn't want to walk away, they can release the seller from all harm and they can take care of doing the repairs. Okay. If nothing happens within a certain amount of time, I think it's 2 days on here, then the buyer accepts the property as is. All right. Change in buyer's financial status. So sometimes life happens. The buyer could lose this contract because of something that's beyond their control. An example of that would be they got laid off. Okay, if they got laid off, obviously they didn't mean that to happen. They weren't expecting it, but lo and behold, they got a pink slip. Now what do you do? Well, they can't get the mortgage because the mortgage company, by law, cannot accept income. I'm sorry, unemployment as income to qualify for the loan. They must be gainfully employed. Well, now they're not gainfully employed. What are they going to do? well, they basically are going to lose the sale. They get their deposit back. It is not a default. Okay. What else happens if, let's say, you got a married couple buying the house and one of them passes away? This happened to me. Well, they wouldn't be obligated to go through the contract because collectively, Mary and Joe were buying this property. And now Mary's still here and Joe's not. That's a change in buyer's financial status. It sucks because it meant we did all this work and none of us are getting paid. Seller's not happy if you're on the seller side. You're not happy because you did all this work. But just get used to the fact that life happens in real estate in a lot of different ways. Divorces is another common one, but that actually is a good one for us. We benefit from that one. The clients don't. But when you've got a client that's getting a divorce and you sold them the house, you now have a listing on the house you sold them. Generally, hopefully you kept in good touch with them. And I've had that conversation too. And I go, look, Joe and Mary, I know life happens and I get to tell them my own personal story. I've been there. In fact, I've been there 3 times. So this isn't anything new for me. We always get a chuckle out of that, but it's true. Okay. Not that that's a good thing to be proud of, but anyway, the bottom line is life happens. And I just basically said, look, at the end of the day, the bottom line is I still work equally for both of you, and it's in our common goal and interest that we work together to get the property sold so you guys can, go about your lives the way you want to do. And that's pretty much how I handle that. And it's an easy one. But yeah, divorces are great for our business. I mean, not being, well, whatever I am being. But anyway. All right. Seller representation, status of water, status of sewer. So real simple. That's going to be on the listing. It should be on the tax record as well. You do want to pay attention to that. Let me just make sure here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I just saw a chat here that's asked if tenant contracts would be reviewed. No, that's not part of this, but I will set that up for next week. Okay. Yes. All right. Lauren already answered that. Let's go back here. All right. Public water and sewer is your most common one, selling properties in the city, but do pay attention to the fact that other forms do exist. If you're selling in a rural community, usually it's going to be on-site water. We commonly call that a well. Could be community water. So I'll give you an example. There's a community in my township, in Heidelberg Township, which is called Heidelberg Heights. It is not public water, okay, because it's an independent company that owns the water rights and the sewer rights, okay? It's not municipal, in other words. That's community water. They're not that often. They're not that common, but they do have those. Same thing with sewer. Public sewer could be community sewer. Heidelberg Heights has community sewer as well because it's a private company. But usually you're going to either be checking public. Let's, for sake of this argument, we're doing public water, public sewer. That's what you check. But if you are going with something that has individual online sewage disposal system, see notice 1, that's the most common one you'll see. In which case, this box gets checked and not this one. And then you're obligated to go through this explanatory information, explain what sewer notice 1 means. Okay, basically it just says that there's an on-site system that's maintained by you, the homeowner. So if you're buying this property, it's your job to maintain that system. There's other ones too. We don't have time to explore them all. You can do that on your own. Historic preservation isn't something that you'll normally run into, but you may. So if you sell a property in certain parts of Allentown, certain parts of Bethlehem, or certain parts of Easton, there are historic districts on there. That'll be on the tax record. It'll also be on the listing. So basically pay attention to that if it exists, because that means that, yeah, you're buying this property on New Street in Bethlehem, and that is part of the historic area. The bottom line is the Historic Society may have say over what kind of windows you could put in and things like that, even what kind of trees you can plant. Okay. So people buying it understand that. Land use restrictions are things that you may run into when you sell in a rural area if you're selling on large parcels of land, farms and things like that, because there's the Farm and Forest Land Assessment Act or Clean and Green Program or Act 319 of 1974. I know they touched on a couple of these things in your real estate classes. Okay. We don't have to go into great detail about them. When you run into this situation and you're not sure, you call me or you talk to one of us in the business. We can kind of step you through it. Just know, for example, they exist. And because that's a potential for this agreement of sale, there's also more explanatory information out of each one of these programs. So whatever one applies is what you want to read to your client, make sure they understand. All right, real estate disclosure law. There's nothing we need to do with this except to state that all properties that are sold of one and not more than 4 units residential must have a seller's disclosure law. There's 2 exceptions to that rule. One is a bank. If it's a bank-owned property, meaning the bank took this property back in foreclosure, they are exempt from providing a seller's disclosure because they never lived there. They don't know anything about it. Therefore, they have nothing to disclose. Usually the property is in disrepair, but not always. Okay. And it means that the buyer, it's up to them if they want to do their own inspections. Most of the time, in all fairness, when you're selling a property like that, it's usually not to the Johnny homeowner who's going to move in. It's usually to an investor who's going to buy it and rehab it anyway. But just be aware of that. The second example of that would be in an estate sale. An estate sale may not have anybody left alive who actually can disclose anything about the property, in which case the executor of the estate, could be an attorney, is not required to fill out a seller's disclosure. Now, there is one exception to that rule. If, let's say, the estate is being settled by a family relative, maybe a son or daughter, or even a cousin or something like that, these people are obligated to fill out a disclosure, at least partially, with whatever they know. But they're not. They're going to have a lot of things checked on there. This is unknown, unknown, unknown. So you may get a disclosure with limited information on it. Okay. Either way, in that case, it's up to your buyer to, maybe do their own due diligence a little bit more than they otherwise would have. If there are any outstanding public or private assessments against the property, that should actually be on the disclosure statement. If you find out after the fact that there are, it does become an issue because the seller is obligated to pass that information on to the buyer. I'll give you an example. Typically, when you're buying a property, and let's say you're buying a house and it's got a septic system on it, but the seller has been notified in writing that next year this borough, township, whatever, is coming through with municipal sewer, and that it's going to cost everybody $10,000 to hook into the sewer system and close off their septic system, then that would be something where it's a public assessment against this property. It doesn't exist yet. It's just known at this point in time. So you must disclose that information. Now, the buyer has the right to say, okay, so I know I'm buying this property, and next year I'm going to have to pay to hook up to the sewer. That would be something that would have to be listed on there. Other things would be if there's an outstanding, I don't know, fine against this property from the municipality for whatever, the seller's obligated to pass that information on. Okay. And if they don't, then it becomes an issue. So basically, if they have any issues, they fill it out. Usually you're going to find this is blank. But a lot of times you'll find that this is going to be on the seller's disclosure. If I'm the one filling this out and it's on the seller's disclosure, I should fill in that information here. Highway occupancy permit isn't going to happen. You're not going to need it. Basically, that means that if you've got an area where you're buying a property that needs a road to get to it, which generally means it's not going to be a pre-existing home, then you may have to file a highway occupancy permit. Well, we wouldn't be doing that in this case because it would be new construction. The builder would have already done it. And this wouldn't apply on this contract because that would mean we'd buying a vacant piece of land and we have a different contract for vacant land. So you really wouldn't need it here, but they put it here. All right, Internet of Things to do, IoT. What does it mean? Okay, basically, nowadays, you ever heard of a smart house? You can buy a smart house. You can buy a house that basically the seller can control everything with their phone. If that's the case, the seller is obligated to make sure they put everything to default 0 when they're selling this property so that the buyer can hire their security company to come in and set it up for them. Okay. And the reason why it's on our contract is because it's really like another set of keys. And while in the past we didn't have this thing in our contract because it was only added within the last couple of years, the bottom line is we're, as the agents, responsible for making sure everybody does their job here. So the seller, by their agent, is notified that, hey, that you got to make sure that you have the security come in and kind of disconnect everything. And then we introduce them to the buyer, and the buyer can come in and they can connect everything with their own usernames and passwords and accounts. Or the buyer may choose not to even use the smart house thing and say, okay, just bring it offline and I'm not going to use the security system. Buyer's choice. Okay. But you don't want 2 months after settlement, especially if something happened at settlement that was a little off color, to have the seller being able to control the buyer's thermostat or the garage door opener and things like that. So it's on here so that we don't get sued. That's the only reason it's here. Waiver of contingencies. If the agreement is contingent on buyer's right to inspect or repair the property, they get to do that. If they don't do it, then they basically waive it. Okay. And their buyer's due diligence and inspections are listed below. Buyer's rights and responsibilities. Seller will provide access to anybody that needs to get into the property. Even mortgage lenders, surveyors, municipal officials, appraisers, inspectors. Already said that. And unless otherwise agreed, only parties and the real estate licensees may attend inspections. Buyer may make 2 pre-settlement walkthrough inspections of the property for the limited purpose of determining that the condition of the property is as required by the agreement and any addenda, and buyer's right to these inspections is not waived by any other provision of this agreement. All right, let me back up there and explain that. Used to be, even if the buyer didn't do any inspections on the property, they had a right to do a final walkthrough. Everybody knows this. If you ever bought a property, you did a final walkthrough inspection before you went to settlement and signed all these documents and pledged your life and your fortune to making sure you're buying this property right now. All that's fine, well, and good, and that's why you do that. Why do we have 2? Well, you may have negotiated for repairs, or there may have been a municipal inspection requirement. And so there may have been repairs that happened that we included in this contract. And now the time has passed and the seller agrees to do them. Well, we have a right to verify that we are accepting those repairs as is. So typically what I do in that case is if I'm working with the buyer and we're doing inspections and there's repairs noted and the seller agrees to do them, then we're going to go in there and maybe a week or 10 days before settlement, see how it's going. Hopefully they're completed. Hopefully they're doing a good job. If they're not, this is the time when we can notify, hey, I'm not liking how this is going, or I'm not satisfied with the results of this repair. And therefore I want you to do it again, or I want you to correct it, because when I come back in another 7 days for the final walkthrough, I want to be able to accept this property. If not, it could hold up settlement. So that's why they added the 2 potential walkthroughs. So bold type in person and in paragraph 3 for a reason. Seller will have heating and all utilities, including fuel, on for all inspections and appraisals. How can I inspect the property if the lights are off, if the heat's off? So all inspectors, including home inspectors, are authorized to provide a copy of any inspection report to the broker for the buyer. Seller has the right upon request to receive a free copy of any inspection report for the party for whom it was performed. Unless otherwise stated, seller does not have the right to receive a copy to any lender's appraisal. Sellers do not get copies of the buyer's appraisal. Buyer paid for the appraisal. In fact, when I'm on the seller's side, the only time I get a copy of the appraisal is if it didn't appraise, because then I need proof. So I don't really want a copy of the appraisal. I don't care if it appraised for more money. As long as it appraised for enough money, that's all we care about. Now, one by one, we get to go through and elect or waive whatever inspections we want to have. So we just told you how the due diligence process worked, how the inspections work. Now we have to determine what inspections we're going to do. Home inspection is the most common one, and they would simply initial here, or if they're waiving it, they initial here. So the home inspection, which it would include, if needed, environmental hazards such as mold. Buyer may conduct an inspection of the property, structural components, roof, exterior windows, blah, blah, blah. Basically, they get to elect it here. Wood infestation would be if they want to do what we call a termite inspection. It's really not the proper name. I call it a termite inspection, but it's actually a WDI, or wood destroying insect, because it's not exclusive to termites. It could be carpenter ants or carpenter bees or anything else that eats wood. So they can have that separately. Usually the home inspection companies also do termite inspections as well. Okay. But they could maybe elect or waive that. Deed restrictions in zoning. Generally, you got to fill in the present use. So that's going to be on the tax record. Let's say it says single family residential. That's what would go there. That's common. Single family residential. That would be one for that. Single home. So that would be what would go in there. Water service, would we do? All right. Deed restrictions in zoning. Let me back up a minute. Generally, if you're buying this property and it's a residential property, your buyer is buying it as a residential property, do you need to verify with zoning that it's already legally being used the way you want to use it? No. So you can waive this. Okay. When would be the difference of that? Let's say you're buying this property like on a main street that's mixed use instead of, medium density residential. It could be mixed use, where let's say Union Boulevard is an example I like to use because you got residential properties on Union Boulevard and you got a lot of commercial stuff. Okay, so a lot of the zoning there is mixed use. Well, let's say you're buying this building and it's currently a residential property, but you want to put your attorney's office there, or you want to put your architect's office there, or a dentist office there. We might think that zoning allows for that, but there might be certain requirements to do that. In that case, for protection of my buyer, I would make this elected, where they can investigate easements, deed and use restrictions, including any historic preservation restrictions or ordinances that apply to the property, and review local zoning ordinances. Buyer may verify that the present use of the property, such as in-law quarters, apartment, home office, daycare, commercial recreational vehicle parking, short-term rentals, is permitted, and may elect the agreement contingent upon an anticipated use. Present use is that. So you would elect it in that case. So does that mean most of the time that's going to happen? No, most of the time you're going to leave that blank. Water service, if it's public water, it's generally waived. I mean, can you test the water? Yeah, you can, but the seller's not obligated to provide you the water to your taste. They're provided to provide you clear and clean water. Now, if you're selling a property with a well, you should always elect this, because a lot of wells are polluted, and even the sellers don't know because they don't test them often enough. So you should really test the well. Okay. Radon, that's up to the individual. If they care about it, test for it. If they don't, waive it. Okay. On-lot sewer. Well, it says right there, if applicable. If it don't have one, such as public sewer, you have to waive it because there's nothing to inspect. It'd be amazing how you see public water and sewer. Oh, they want to check the sewer anyway. Well, it's not applicable. Okay. If you're worried about the sewer lateral pipe, well, quite frankly, that can be done in the general home inspection if you want. Okay. So, and there are sewer lateral inspections in certain municipalities. Okay. So, on lot sewer, you don't have an on lot sewer. Even if you have a sewer lateral pipe, it's going to the public system in the street. Property and flood insurance, this is a hit and miss. If the property, and this will be a question that's on the seller's disclosure, if the property shows that there were other insurance claims filed on this property in the past, such as it shows there was fire damage or flood damage, it might have been repaired, you still might want to elect to verify that the insurance company isn't digging it for a problem, property for insurance purposes. You don't want to find out, oh man, insurance to this property is going to be $4,000 a year. I was expecting $800. Okay, well, then you might want to find that out. But normally, if you don't see that, and if it's not in a flood zone, it's waived. Okay. Property boundaries is almost always waived. Here's what it says: buyer may engage the services of a surveyor, title abstractor, or other qualified professional to possess the legal description. Okay. Pretty much, if you elect it, the buyer basically is kind of saying they want to pay $7,000 or $8,000 for a survey. Well, most buyers don't want to do that, so it's generally waived. Okay. Lead-based paint hazards should always be waived. Let me give you my personal opinion on that. If you're buying a property before 1978, I don't need to pay $100 to a home inspector to tell me there's lead paint in the house. There simply is, and you shouldn't eat it. So don't worry about inspecting for it. The big question really is, are you worried about a house that may have lead paint in it? If you are, and if this property is older than 1978, then we got to stop right here and not buy this property. We got to find you something newer than 1978, because no seller is going to scrape every piece of woodwork and every wall and every ceiling in the house to make sure you don't have lead paint in there somewhere. That costs thousands and thousands of dollars. So now, that doesn't mean to say that if you see cracked or peeling paint, that shouldn't be repaired. Of course it should be. But we're basically saying, do we really need to do a lead paint inspection? No. We can find that out in the general home inspection if we've got an issue. And by the way, that is one of the things that will be picked up on an appraisal. They will note that there's cracked or peeling paint. And if it's a government finance deal, they'll make you repair it before settlement. Conventional doesn't make you do it. Leave that on here. Okay. And other is for anything else. Let's say you got a buyer that says, you know what, I don't need to do a whole home inspection. I would just like to have the furnace inspected, and I would like to have the roof inspected. Well, you could type in roof inspection and heating unit inspection, HVAC inspection. So they could just limit their inspections to just two things. So then you would elect this. Otherwise, elected and waived can be left blank. And if there are existing conditions, they can also be noted here that the buyer is accepting these existing conditions as is. These conditions could still be subject to the financing approval, but there you go. Now, this next paragraph on paragraph D is simply another finding of facts or explanatory information to all the things having to do with all these inspections. It's just things to point out as you go in. It's just for informational purposes. Now, here's the big one, inspection contingency. So here is another time is of the essence clause. In this case, it's blank days 10 if not specified. What does this one mean? Well, this means we have to get this done by this amount of time. So the execution date on the contract was that date that all parties signed. Depending on what inspections my buyer is doing, I'm fine with the 10 days. But if I am doing a water test and a radon test and a septic inspection, I find 10 days to not be sufficient, in which case I generally use 15. Part of the reason is I can get the inspections done within a day or two, okay, once we have a signed contract. That's not the issue, getting the appointment. There's plenty of inspection companies that will come out there. Oh, yeah, I could fit that in for Thursday or Friday of this week yet. It's only Tuesday. Problem is that if I'm doing a radon test, that takes 5 days for that report to come out. The water test takes 5 days to come back, and the septic test can take even longer, depending on what type of septic inspection they're doing. So I find that anytime there's lab tests involved, it's simply better to give yourself an extra 5 days so we can get those reports back. So then I use 15. But if I'm just doing termite and home inspection, roof inspection, yeah, 10 days is fine. Now, and then it basically says when this day contingency result inspection. Okay, if the results of the inspection elected are satisfactory, buyer presents all reports, the entirety of the seller, and accepts the property. That almost never happens. If the result of the inspection elected in paragraph 3 are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all reports, the entirety of the seller, and terminate the agreement of sale. We hope that doesn't happen. So the third one is the most common one. If the results of any inspection elected in paragraph 12 are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all reports entirely to the seller with a written corrective proposal listing corrections and/or credits desired by the buyer. This is where we get into what the buyer asked for. And we have a buyer reply to inspection addendum that we use for that purpose. And that form basically lists what the buyer is concerned about. We don't have enough time in detail to go into all of it, but the bottom line basically says that if the seller acknowledges the repairs and does all the repair, buyers accept the property. If the sellers do not acknowledge all the repairs, but maybe some of the repairs, buyer can accept the property or they can terminate the agreement of sale. If the buyer doesn't terminate the agreement of sale within 2 days, buyer accepts the property with the proposed terms. Okay. One other note on septics, if the septic inspection comes back showing that there is a problem with the septic and we don't know what it is, then the default time changes automatically to 25 days if not specified. Now, that means that may pass your contract date and you have to do another addendum for that. But if the septic failed, we will not necessarily be able to determine what the level of failure was without getting the local municipal sewer enforcement officer involved. And that can take some time. If all parties still want to keep the contract alive, then that's what happens. If the buyer wants to terminate at that point, they can certainly do so. Title survey and cost. Here's another times of the essence clause. I already talked about it, but here's where it is on the paper. Within blank day 7 if not specified from the execution date, buyer will order from a reputable title company to deliver to seller a comprehensive title report on the property. Buyer will deliver a free copy of the title report to the seller. Buyers encouraged to get owner's title insurance, blah, blah, blah. Buyer will pay for the following: title search, title insurance, mechanics lien insurance, fee for cancellation, flood insurance, fire insurance. All right, all that stuff. This is all the stuff that the buyer gets on their closing cost estimate. Yeah, any surveys, right? If there are going to be mineral rights that are going to be kept by the seller, they would be listed here. I have never run into this in 38 years. Okay. There are parts of the state that do run into this. I understand it's more prevalent out west in Pittsburgh area, but we just don't run into it here. At least I never have. But it's there to say that if the seller is retaining them, they've disclosed that and the buyer's accepting it under those conditions. Other parts of the country, it's more common too. Okay. Cold notice is also part of the same thing. Recreational cabin, I've never filled that out. It's never sold a recreational cabin. Private transfer fee, I've never filled that out. is made part of the agreement. Private transfer fee is defined and regulated by the Private Transfer Fee Obligation Act of. You probably won't run into it. Notice assessments and municipal requirements we do run into. Basically, if you are in an area that has a mandatory certificate of occupancy, then the seller is obligated to order the inspection report and pay for it. That's what this language says. It does not say they have to repair it. That can be negotiated. Okay. But they are required to order it and pay for it. And that's where it comes under paragraph B. It required by law within blank days, 30 days from the execution date of the agreement, but in no case later than 15 days prior to settlement, seller will order at their expense a certification from the appropriate municipal department disclosing notice of any uncorrected violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, or fire ordinances, or a certificate permitting occupancy of the property. If the buyer receives a notice of any required repairs, buyer will deliver a copy of the notice to the seller. Then, within 5 days of receiving the notice from the municipality, repairs or improvements are required, seller will deliver a copy of the notice to the buyer and notify the buyer in writing whether they will make the required repairs or not make the required repairs. In which case, the buyer then has 5 days to say they will accept a temporary access or they will terminate the agreement of sale. Everybody find out how that works? So the seller pays for the inspection report. Generally, I tell my sellers, I mean, unless it's something we're not aware of, you should probably fix whatever the municipal requirements are. Because if the buyer terminates it, this isn't going to go away. You're going to have the same problem to the next buyer. Okay. Um, so the buyer basically accepts the property and they could do the repairs. So it does become a negotiation. Now, if you are selling a property that's in a condo or planned community, you got to check whichever box applies here and understand that there's probably going to be a resale certificate. And basically, the resale certificate has to be gotten within 15 days from the execution date of the contract. Seller is responsible for getting that at their expense from the association, and the buyer then has up until that time and 5 days after that time to accept the terms of the planned community or HOA, or they can terminate the agreement of sale. That's where it says it right there. Whichever occurs first, and buyer notice seller must be in writing upon buyer declaring the agreement void, blah, blah, blah. If the association has the right to buy the property with a first right of refusal, they must make that known to the buyer, and they have to let them know whether their intentions are to buy the property or not. Don't run into that much, but I have run into it. Real estate taxes and assessed value is based on the school districts and municipalities, okay, and the taxing authorities, not us. So we're not responsible if taxes go up between the time we sign an agreement of sale and settle on that property. Maintenance and risk of loss is the clause really more for the seller, but a notice to the buyer that the seller promises to maintain the property in its present condition, including but not limited to structures, grounds, fixtures, appliances, personal property. And they also will keep the property insured until they go to settlement, because the buyer's insurance doesn't kick in until the closing date. The buyer gets to do a walkthrough for that particular reason. So, you go in there and the day of the walkthrough, you find out there's something missing that's supposed to be there. Someone stole the stove last night. Someone broke a window. Okay. Then the seller has to get that fixed, whether it's an insurance claim or whatever the case may be. And if the seller does not repair or replace any failed part of the thing that or fails to notify the buyer of their choice, buyer will tell the seller whether they will accept the property or terminate the agreement of sale. And if buyer fails to respond, then they are accepting the property. If they fail to respond, they accept the property and release the seller from all harm. Okay. Home warranties, not worth really talking about this, except to say that if your buyer is uncomfortable about the property, we could offer them a home warranty. We don't get paid to do that, but we do have home warranties that are available that they can buy, and they can insure them, maybe give them a peace of mind type of thing for a year. And if they really like to continue that peace of mind, they can continue their warranty for years to come. Nothing gets recorded in the Office of Deeds before settlement. If the buyer would have something recorded prior to that date, that would be considered a default. The agreement is not assignable. Only the binding parties that are listed here, their representatives and guardians, to the extent assignable, only signs of the parties. Buyer will not transfer or sign this agreement without written notice to the seller unless otherwise stated in the agreement, and assignment of the agreement may result in additional transfer taxes. Governing law, venue, and personal jurisdiction is the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we don't care what the laws are someplace else, only here. If you're a foreigner buying the property, you have to prove that you have that you are allowed to buy property in the United States. Now that's not something we do. That notice is put here, but that is something that the lender determines when they approve your buyer. Notice regarding convicted sex offenders, basically, we're not obligated to look that up, but if the buyer wants to know, they can go onto Megan's Law website on their own. And representation basically states that we represented the property as best we could based on the information we have. No other claims, advertising, or personal activities are involved in this. Buyer has inspected property, including fixtures and personal property, unless otherwise stated in the agreement. Okay. And are subject to those inspections. Buyer acknowledges that we, the brokers, licensees, employees, officers, partners, have not made an independent examination or determination of the structural soundness of the property. Never go into a property with your buyer and pass yourself off as an expert. And that can be tough if you have any contracting experience, as I do, because I do tell them my opinion on things I see, but I also recommend they hire somebody who's a professional to verify this, that, or the other thing that they're not sure of. Default, termination, return of deposit. We've talked about it already. If the buyer defaults, then they could lose their deposit. If they terminate for a legitimate reason here, such as we couldn't negotiate repairs or we couldn't work through difficulties of an appraisal that didn't happen, or whatever the case may be, then the buyer gets their money back. If there is a dispute over entitlement, this is under paragraph C, okay, that is unresolved, the default time is, and this is the last one of these we have, 180 days, and the buyer gets their money back. If the seller does not sign a release to the buyer to give them their money back, even though by contract they should, says it all in here, we can't make them do that. But then the buyer would have to sue the seller for their deposit. Okay. We, as a real estate body, are not able to determine who's at fault. It has to go before a court. Rarely does that happen, but it's in the language in case it does. Buyer and seller agree that the broker who holds and distributes deposit money pursuant to terms paragraph 26, paragraph will not be liable. We have to keep that money in escrow until a court releases it, or until both parties sign off on a release, or, and this is the most common one, a successful settlement. Okay. Unless otherwise checked, some seller may retain sums paid by buyer includes deposit monies. As the buyer agent, you always want to check paragraph G. It says the seller is limited to retaining sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, as liquidated damages. What it means is this: if you want to protect your buyer's interest and your buyer does default and they sign off on releasing the funds, well, we don't want them to incur further damage by getting sued for even more from the sellers, even though the buyer is the one at fault. At least all they can lose is their deposit. If you don't check that box, you're not a very good buyer agent. So don't forget to do that. Mediation exists to basically say that if we do end up for any reason in a dispute, there is a local board of realtors, mediation board, that hears those cases. Everybody is, by this contract, agreeing to try to solve it at that level first. And the release that we've referred to many times as paragraph 28 is right here, where this buyer releases, proclaims, and forever discharges the seller, you, me, the brokers, licensees, blah, blah, blah. With one exception, starting down here in the last 3 lines of this paragraph, it says, should seller be in default under the terms of this agreement, meaning the seller changes their mind about selling the property, the buyer can sue them. Or if they're in violation of any seller disclosure law or regulation, okay, we can prove the seller lied on the seller's disclosure. This release does not deprive the buyer of any right to pursue any remedy that may be available under law or equity, and this release will survive settlement. So this is letting us off the hook, so to speak, but not necessarily the seller if they lied on the seller's disclosure. Okay. Real estate recovery fund. So the buyer gave me $20,000 down for me to turn into the seller. But instead, I go to Wind Creek tonight and I put it on black and red comes up. Well, we all know what happens then. I leave the country. Well, Lauren's on the hook for it. But let's say Lauren says, you know what, I'm out of here too. And he takes the entire escrow fund and we both go to Las Vegas or maybe Tahiti. In other words, we're not coming back. The
They'll
real estate
catch us in
recovery
Las
fund
Vegas.
would reimburse the seller. That's what would happen. Okay, so every contract is insured for up to $100,000. We never take more than $100,000. Communication with buyer and seller simply means that the conversations that happen between the buyer and seller are through the agents, not through anyone else. Okay. And okay. Okay, that's whenever the agreement contains provisions requires or allows communication to a buyer, that provision shall be satisfied with communication delivered to the broker or the buyer. Pretty much what I just said. Headings are for convenience, and there are other addendums that may be attached to this agreement of sale. Some of which we can't talk about now because we are simply out of time. But just be aware, and we'll cover some more of these later in the week as they come up. There are sale contingencies which we contingent upon the sale or settlement of other property. I did mention the appraisal contingency addendum. You would check this box and include it here. There's also a price escalation addendum, which usually is the other most common one that comes up here. So you would type that in here and check that box. These are other addendums that we'll talk about a little bit later. We just don't have time to go into them today. But just know that if there are going to be other attachments, another one was the tenant occupied addendum. I mentioned that if you're buying a property, well, that would come up here. That would be the tenant occupied addendum. Well, that one didn't self-populate, but that's what you would put in there. There's also additional terms, and this is an area where you get to play lawyer for a little bit. There are some examples of that. Let's say your buyer is interested in the property and wants to buy it and is willing to maybe accept it with maybe some repairs being done. Okay. Buyer could put those terms in here. Let's say the opposite is true. Let's say that I went back and said on the um, municipal requirements that the seller is not obligated to do repairs, but I said that they should. Well, the buyer could put in there and make that part of the contract and say, and this is probably one of the most common ones, because the only thing by contract the seller is obligated to do is order the inspection and give a report to the buyer of the repairs that need to be done before the buyer can move into the property. Okay. Well, what I try to do with my seller, if it's a retailable house, is say, look, let's get highest and best on this property by fixing it. It's going to be minor stuff. And that's what we generally do. So I would put on here for the buyer, seller agrees to provide a, clear CO from whomever, Township of Whitehall, City of Allentown, whatever applies at settlement. In which case, now I'm obligating the seller to do whatever repairs, and the seller may not even have gotten the report yet. I'm simply obligating the seller to do those. So those are some of the things that get put in there. There are others. At the end of the day, you get down the list here. The seller's going to initial that they've received the consumer notice. Should have done that long before now. That they received a statement of closing costs. Get it from the lender. Have them sign it. They received the deposit money notice. I didn't show you that form, but it's simple. It says the buyer acknowledges that the deposit is being held by the listing broker. If it is, okay, we don't need it if we're holding it, okay. And if applicable, that they receive the lead-based paint hazard note disclosure, which would be part of the seller's disclosure if the property was built before 1978. So the initial, applicable initial, down here they sign and date it, and basically then the thing gets prepared and you prepare the whole file to go to the seller. That's all we have time for today. So I'm going to ask you if anybody has any questions at this point. I promise that the rest of the classes do not go beyond the 2-hour window that we normally do. This one does for a lot of good reasons, especially with the new stuff that we're dealing with now. So, any questions? Just unmute and speak up if need be. Seeing none, we will be back here tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Should be finished by tomorrow's stuff. Should get us out of here 11:30, 11:40, something in that range. Generally not the full 2 hours, but we will be. That's what we'll be doing on tomorrow. All right. Thank you for your participation.
Thanks.
And we will sign out.